Welcome back, everyone. I want to thank Kaylin for those wonderful opening remarks that really do frame our intent for the discussions over the next 2 days. I want to remind our audience that live captioning is available for all sessions by using the link at the bottom of your screen. This session will be recorded for future viewing, and we will be sending out information through your registration after the close of the symposium. We ask that everyone please use the Q&A function to ask your questions, but I want to remind you that we will not have time to answer and address every single question. Also, in the interest of time, we've decided to forego our full introductions, and if you want to learn more about our panelists in any of the sessions, please visit the website or look to your program for the full biographies. I'm very pleased to be moderating our first session, Museum Resource Allocation. We wanted to look at the cost of collecting, a complex architecture that can be hard to succinctly define and one that continues to evolve for all museums, regardless of genre or mission. I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists. Dr. Agustín Arteaga is the Eugene McDermott Director of the Dallas Museum of Art. Arteaga previously served as director at the Museo Nacional de Arte in Mexico City, the director of the Museo de Arte de Ponce in Puerto Rico, and the founding director of the Museo de Arte Latinoamericano de Buenos Aires Fundación Constantini in Argentina. Betsy Bradley was appointed director of the Mississippi Museum of Art in December 2001. Previously, Betsy served as the executive director of the Mississippi Arts Commission. Professor Michael O'Hare, Professor Emeritus at the Goldman School of Public Policy, University of Cal Berkeley, is a longtime student of arts and public policy. Dr. Erin Richardson facilitates museums and cultural organizations' capacity for mission delivery, particularly relating to art and artifact collections. With over 20 years experience working with cultural heritage objects in museums, she founded the consulting firm Frank and Glory in 2018 to assist museums in solving long-term collection problems so that they may effectively serve their communities. And finally, Joe Thompson is the founding director of the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, North Adams, Massachusetts, having guided the museum's development and arts programming since its inception in 1987. My name is Andrew Saluti, and I'm the program coordinator for the graduate program in museum studies here at Syracuse University. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here, and I'd like to go ahead and jump right in. The cost of collections is not normally something that the general public considers when we're thinking about a museum's holdings, but it is all too well known to those in the field. I'd like to start a discussion this morning by asking our directors how they would define these costs and how these costs have evolved over the years. And let's start with Dr. Agustín.
We were told to unmute. I remember that now. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So first of all, I was saying that ladies first, but I'm happy to go if you want me to do, Betsy. And I just want to say thank you for having us. I feel that these conversations are going to be very important. I think that there's a lot of public information going around talking about something that has not yet been properly defined by organizations. And we still need to wrap our heads around the way that things will continue going on forward in the future. But I feel that it's really important that these discussions come to the public eye and that people listen to what are we thinking as professionals in the field and experts in many other areas on this very important topic. The cost of collecting, starts very much in the moment when a work that is not bequested, you have to pay for it. So you start by paying market value for a work of art, and then there's going to be a lot of obvious costs that start accumulating at the moment that you have that acquisitions. You have to do all the due diligence, working with conservators, making sure that the work that comes to the museum is in perfect condition. Usually, conservators would like to see it at the best, so they will intervene it one way or another, clean it up, prepare it, and then that continues to go on and on with the accession process, where very little things, everything adds up, even to transport the work to the museum, start by doing the process of access, having professional photography being taken for filing, for setting up in websites, for press releases, and then you have to think about that, even moving the work into the galleries, if that's hopefully what happens, you will have either to replace another work, you have to fix walls, have preparators moving in, preparing materials that are actually extremely significant, which is the interpretation materials for that work to be presented to the public, preparing walls, vitrines, pedestals, whatever it is regarding the kind of object. And insurance kicks in the moment that you buy the object or get the object. Sometimes objects are very big, especially when you talk about contemporary art. Not all of them can have a space in a gallery immediately, and there's sometimes huge installations, and if they have to go to storage, in our case, we have completely our storage packed, so we need to have to use outside the storage, which comes at a cost, and that has to do with other things, like when we're starting acquiring works of art, we're always looking about what is going to be the cost of keeping that work with us for the years to come. So sometimes we even have to look at what would be the cost over 10 to 15 years to storage a big contemporary art piece outside of our premises. And just sending it to the storage, having the proper crating, whether it requires special materials to be wrapped up and preserved from climate issues, and all the time that is involved, that has to do with salaries. This is direct cost for a collection. The times that all the stuff that I had mentioned really makes a significant mark in budgets in museums. And this is only the beginning of a process, so that goes on. And we think about what is the cost of a collection when we acquire, but we also have to think what is the cost of the collection when we deaccess, which is another large process. The same thing, you have to do deeper studies, you have to make sure that conservation, everything that would justify and make a good deaccessioning for the many different reasons that we know that deaccession happens. Mm-hmm. I don't know if this is just kind of to start thinking about the cost of acquiring a work of art, and then we look at it, and museums will accumulate large number of works, and that cost is multiplied infinitely by the numbers of works that we have. So I don't know, I probably will stop there just to set the beginning of the conversation.
Well, it is. I mean, it's the foundation of what we're actually talking about. It doesn't end with the object. Betsy, I wonder if you wanted to add or comment on any of these aspects.
Sure. Thank you, Andrew. Good morning. I'm delighted to be here. And if I may, I'd like to also thank Kaywin for so brilliantly framing the context of our conversations for the next couple of days. I've been really fascinated by the enormous interest in this symposium and in this deaccessioning conversation. And I too can't help but wonder why, and if it's the conversation to be having after all that we've learned in the last 12 months. I hope that history won't judge us as having a kind of Swiftian debate about how many angels can fit on a pin's head, but instead understand that we have a deep interest in being together to discuss the role, practice, and responsibility of art museums in society at this precise moment in our history. Nevertheless, Indra, you asked a question. Let me try to answer it. For museums, as you know, the cost of collecting is synonymous with direct care of that collection, whether one is abiding by the definitions created by AAM or AAMD. And there's a continuum between the most specific, strictly defined costs that Agustín so beautifully laid out, from the conservation, matting, and framing to staff, storage, all of those things. Our museum is committed to keeping as few objects as possible in storage, with the obvious exception of works on paper. And so in non-COVID years, we actively curate exhibitions from our collection and travel them to some of our 30 statewide affiliates that are mostly in rural communities, free of charge. That work, of course, does cost hard dollars, but it comes from a sense of responsibility that is implied when considering care. So I think there is a bigger conversation to be held in regards to the stewardship of collections by art museums from the perspective of community relevance and relationships. Every curator and collector brings their own personal interest to the building of an institution's collection, and each one actually encumbers his or her successors with a burden of care. So what happens when the inheritance of care is in conflict with the value of ownership, especially if one considers the care of a collection to be true stewardship? It goes without saying that over time, a collection builds that reflects some very different priorities. Which of these priorities stand the test of times and which ones don't? Which ones deserve the cost of passively pushing forward the expenditures on direct care? Most collections include the interest of wealthy collectors, academically knowledgeable art historians, connoisseurs of narrow categories of objects, sometimes colonizers and plunderers. And yet, part of the cost of stewardship includes the cost of sharing objects with our communities at this very moment in history. We have a responsibility to share works of art in a way that evokes personal meaning and relevant conversation. That's not inexpensive. That implies interpretation, partnership building, listening to community folks, as well as considerations of possible harm done when challenging works are displayed without the tools necessary to contextualize, confront, or interpret these works. And the cost of doing that badly, infinitely large. So yes, there's the cost of direct care, but if we consider that without a conversation about stewardship, then I think that we're on a path to irrelevance at best or protest and dismantling at worst.
I think that, thank you, Betsy. I think that's extremely well said. And I want to point out that over the course of the next 2 days, we're going to be covering many issues that are going to overlap. The conversation about what defines direct care, which is scheduled for tomorrow, I think is certainly going to be informed by what we talk about today, but also kind of expand that conversation, which is at the core of many of the issues that are being debated. You're absolutely right. I want to switch over now. We're fortunate to have with us Joe Thompson, the founding director of MASMOCA, an institution modeled after the Kunsthalle, a non-collecting museum. So Joe, I wonder if you might discuss the rationale, since you were there from the inception, the rationale for this institutional decision and why it might be relevant for a possible shift or an addition to practice in other institutions.
Well, thank you, and I'm delighted to be here and deeply interested in this conversation. Kunsthalle is close, but not quite right. MASMOCA acts a little like a Kunsthalle, but also a lot like a museum in the sense that we roll our own shows. We make our exhibitions here, and often working disintermediation, we work directly with artists. And I think that decision came from many things, some practical. We had no money. So collecting is terribly expensive, as we've just heard. And I've always viewed art objects as a liability as well as an asset for all the reasons that people here will know. The care and feeding of objects takes things away from other activities. And for us, it was the other activities that were at the core of our institutional interest. MASMOCA was conceived not as a box, but as a platform, as a place where living artists could come, make work, engage in the community, engage with their audience directly in a very disintermediated way, and move on. Maybe a platform is not a perfect metaphor. Maybe it's an artist, maybe it's a line from an artist who we've had both in our stages and in our galleries, Beck, who had that great line about 2 turntables and a microphone. I love that image for a place like MASMOCA. We're also odd in that fully half of our resources, people, money, emotional bandwidth go into the performing arts. And that's very much stems from where artists are at today. I mean, it's what is Laurie Anderson or Robert Wilson or David Byrne or Bill T. Jones? I mean, all those are people who make things, but they also make performances, then they make film and dance. And I don't know that any of those would be pinned down in one box. And so to create an institution that fit their work, that could house their work, that could be welcoming to their work, seemed to require a view of a museum that was far more malleable and porous to those kind of cross-disciplinary activities that define a lot of the most interesting work of our time. And finally, I would just to say here to Agustín and Betsy's work, we were highly aware that taking care of works, I mean, perpetuity's a long time. And so when we've entered into longer relationships, for example, we have collaborations with Laurie Anderson and Jenny Holzer and Saul LeWitt, and those are multi-year, long-term commitments of 15 or 20 or 25 years, and they might be the world's longest temporary exhibitions. But our thinking in each of those cases were that we essentially wanted to put forward to the next generation a referendum and be conscious of asking those who come after to make a conscious, thoughtful decision about whether or not the work, in these cases, long-term, big, multi-work installations. The LeWitt, for example, is 33,000 square feet of space. But we thought it important to ask Saul's children and the studios that follow him and our partners at Yale and Williams and the future directors and curators of MASMOCA, whether the continuation of that big allocation of space, time, and money, 33,000 square feet, was the correct thing to do. And so we set up these relationships with artists or their studios or estates to trigger a conversation, a decade or two into the future, to force that kind of thoughtful reevaluation of what makes sense both for the artist and for the institution. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I think from each of our directors here, it really does illustrate the thoughtfulness that goes into not just collecting, but the thoughtfulness that goes into all of the elements that the museum has to take on. These are very methodical approaches. So switching gears slightly, so Michael, you've published extensively about the need to re-examine both the financial and the human cost of existing museum policy toward collections, toward asset allocation, and sustainability. What do you identify as some of these core challenges and possible strategies for museums in terms of addressing this particular moment?
Sure. What are the big challenges? I guess if I could propose a wrap up, it's if museums could change their apparent focus from engagement, from having art, which is what it looks like they spend a lot of time doing, to engagement with art. That's what it really ought to be about. I mean, my students in my arts and cultural policy course usually come up with a set of criteria for institutional and government policy in the arts. And it comes out like more, better engagement by more people with art. That's the test of whether we're doing the right thing. And I think that's probably right. Well, the art that isn't being engaged with is in storage. And when you start thinking about engagement rather than just possession, then you start asking questions that are best characterized as opportunity cost and the technical language that my economist friends that I hang out with like to use. What is it? What are you giving up by keeping this or that body of work in your basement that realistically you will never show because you're already not showing 95% of your collection for any major museum? And well, what are we giving up? Here's an example. I can make a pretty good case that the collection of one of my favorite museums in the world, the Art Institute of Chicago, that collection is worth $30 billion. Now, if they were to sell 1% of the value of that collection off the bottom, the least valuable, least important objects. Now, that's way more than 1% of the objects. But 1% of the value, money value, the AIC could endow free admission forever. Not just free admission this year, free admission forever. And why is that important? Well, if you pay $25 to go to a museum once, you're going to be tempted to try to stay all day and see everything. And that's a really inferior mode of engagement with art. Nobody goes to the opera for 8 hours. Well, maybe if you're seeing The Ring, but that's kind of a specialized exercise. We want to engage with art with a reasonable amount of time and then have lunch and then go do something else and come back tomorrow. Another problem is that when you go to a museum that's not already congested, I mean, the Uffizi is a special case, MoMA is a special case, but most museums are not congested. And when you go there, there's no less for anyone else. And my economist friends would say, hey, that's a public good. It's non-rival. You're not, it's like listening to an MP3 file of a song. You're not depriving anybody of it. And the price should be free for very sound theoretical reasons. So that's 1% off the bottom. Let's sell another 1%. Let's go crazy. What could we do with that? Well, what we could do with that is to hire 20% more staff. And when I say staff, I'm talking about people like Betsy and Erin and Joseph and Agustín, who are the people with the expertise and the knowledge to stand between art and visitors who really want to engage with it and explain what's going on and what else you should see and why is this important and who are the artist's friends. The kind of curiosity that people bring to this engagement comes from satisfied by the expertise of professionals in this business. They're absolutely critical input to high quality engagement. And then let's do 1% more. Let's go crazy. Now we're down to 97% of the value of the collection. And with the last percent, we can increase the gallery space by about a quarter. And that means we can show a quarter more art, which is now in the basement with nobody looking at it. Looks to me like a great deal. So the big challenge, I guess the big challenge I'd like to put before my museum friends is to tell the truth. And then I think a lot of good things will follow. And by tell the truth, I mean, estimate the value of your collection and put it in your balance sheet the way you do with your endowment, like every other enterprise in the world that follows reasonable accounting rules. Just tell us what you got. And then we can start asking questions about how you're using that precious resource to create value. I think what's going to happen at the end of a process like that is that a lot of this work is going to come out of the basement and go onto the walls of hospitals, city hall, schools, universities, and yes, some private collectors. And it's going to be looked at and engaged with. And that seems to me that advances the mission of a museum as I understand it pretty well.
I think that there's a lot to unpack out of out of the craziness that you just defined, and I do want to get back to it. But one thing that I really want to pinpoint on is this: the need for metrics and the need for data. And I think you're alluding to that really succinctly in terms of institutions looking at their collections, looking at use, looking at yes value, looking at a lot of different metrics that can help define a possible strategy and a path forward as it relates to this allocation of or the cost of collecting, rather. So now I want to go to Dr. Richardson. Your research and practice is long focused on these collections management topics and policies. A recent study that we were just chatting about this week, published by the OCLC Research Library Partnership in Collection Building and Operational Impacts Working Group, titled "The Cost of Stewardship," is a framework that proposes a holistic approach to understanding the resources needed to responsibilities to acquire and steward archives and special collections. So not museums, but from a sister model. Is there any data or resource that identifies the cost in collecting for museum collections? And then how should the information dictate the policy and the practice?
Thanks, Andrew. This is such a fun topic, and I'm such a nerd about this stuff. Okay, so the short answer to your question is there is no information. There is no big repository of data about how much collecting costs. There is no dollar figure attached to an object. There's no published estimate of, you can expect a work to cost X dollars per year over the lifetime of the work. That specific piece of information does not exist. And so I really like talking about the fact that we don't know the answer to this question because we have not asked this question. That is why we do not know the answer. And so my argument is always we must ask this question, and we must be willing to answer this question, and we must trust the answer. So I really appreciate, although we did not rehearse this, what Michael just had to say about collections appearing on balance sheets. I do not believe that collections should be capitalized. That is definitely not what I'm saying here, but I think a big reason that we don't know how much collecting costs is because collections appear nowhere on our balance sheet. If we're going to put them on a balance sheet, I would actually put them in the liability category because they cost money as soon as they cross the threshold. They cost money for the entire time they live in our buildings. And I often work with very small museums. I mean, museums with operating budgets of less than $20,000, like small community history museums. And what I hear from them is, but so-and-so gave us this as a gift. It's a donation. I'm like, but that is not a cost-free transaction. That is a costly transaction. And somehow we need to get into the habit of recording what the costs are. So I want to briefly share my screen because some of these, I want to share some of the things that dance around the question of cost of collections. So I'm going to share this. This is very brief. Okay. So some of this may look familiar to some of you. This publication is called A Public Trust at Risk. It was the first actual study of what's in museums. The purpose of the study was actually to understand the condition of collections in museums, not the cost of collecting. my biggest problem with this is I'm super glad that it was published. It does not address the volume of collections. What it addresses is the fact that we don't know what's in there and we don't know how much it costs to take care of these objects. But it doesn't ever say, it assumes all objects in museums deserve cost investment, financial resources, which is not true. The question is not, do you need this thing? It's, are you taking care of this thing? The follow-up to that study was published in 2019, actually 5 years after it was supposed to be published, which still does not address what's in your collection. This is the publication that you just mentioned, which I think it literally came out like 2 weeks ago. The total cost of stewardship from OCLC, it provides some interesting questions and frameworks for calculating the cost of stewardship. And then there's some ongoing work here. So Culture Track records all kinds of information about all kinds of cultural organizations, does not address collections or the cost of collections in museums, although museums are part of the body of organizations that contribute data to Culture Track. Cultural data projects started as a Pew Charitable Trust project in Philadelphia. It was spun off into its own thing, which Pew likes to do, called Data Arts. Data Arts was eventually assumed by Southern Methodist University. This is a great repository of data about arts organizations. There are almost 1,500 organizations that contribute information to this ongoing growing data set. I used it for my dissertation. Exactly 3 of the more than 1,000 variables collected by Data Arts relate to anything having to do with museum collections. 3. There's one category called collection management, one category called exhibitions, one category called permanent exhibitions. That's it. No other information. And then, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I have some physical books. I'm a museum person. I love show and tell. This publication is called The Cost of Collecting, 1989. This was the first published work done by Lord Cultural Resources, who's now like a powerhouse of cultural research, right? This does actually have a value per object. It was done in the UK. It was commissioned by one of the big overarching umbrella organizations in the UK, but it's from 1989. And they ran into the same problems in 1989 that we still have about data about museum collections. Nobody wanted to answer the question. They said, there's great quotes from their respondents, like, why would I? That's like questioning the benefit of breathing. Why would we question the cost of collecting? This work, also called Active Collections 2018, has a very short article by my colleague Trevor Jones that talks about, here's how you can calculate the cost of collecting for your organization if you want to do that. And my own dissertation from 2018, because whoever gets an opportunity to show their dissertation on TV, there it is. So I set out in this project to figure out what is the cost of collecting in New York State, right? New York State regulates museums, it regulates deaccession. It's the only state that does so. Like, surely New York State keeps all kinds of information about their chartered organizations. Nothing, 0 information. So what I was able to do in my dissertation is cobble together all of this data from all these different sources to essentially come out with a result, which is museums that focus on collections do not focus on audience. So organizations that have gigantic numbers of curators and offsite storage units and outsized collections have a very small amount of budget that goes toward public engagement. So it's really not a both and here, it's really an either or for many museums. So that's just another reason we need to really address what is the cost of collecting. And as far as the policy is concerned, I write collection management policies for a living, and I always, always, always encourage the most strict acquisitions criteria that the museum feels they can get away with, because the idea that something shows up and you take it in, sounds great, and it is what we do, but museums are for people. They are not for objects. If objects and collecting was the end of our job would be so much easier. If we just took in things and left them in storage and didn't have to do anything about that or show them to people, man, that sounds like a sweet deal. But that is not the point. The point is to engage people with art. People. We're not engaging other art with art. People. Objects don't talk to each other in storage.
So you're touching upon one of the elements that I know we discussed in preparation for this session is a larger holistic view of what cost actually means, and going from the financial cost, starting out with the with issues of direct care, with issues of salary, with issues of storage, all of those elements, but also the human cost. What is the human cost of the collections, right? Many in the field stress that museums should be viewed as living organizations, not static repositories, as Erin was just alluding to, and the need to be able to evolve within their communities. I'm wondering how this shift, which we are seeing in Mission, we're seeing in a lot of progressive museum movements, how might this shift the needs and approaches to addressing the cost associated with these collections? That's for anybody. Nobody wants to take that?
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, I think it comes back to this question of what do we care about, and is it objects or the community? And it's, I hope it's not an either or proposition. I hope it's both, but I hope there's a balance. And we talk a lot at our museum about a mission-based balance sheet, so that we know that we're putting our money where our values are. Mm-hmm. We're not encyclopedic. We have no aspirations to be that. And so we feel great accountability to our community for how we spend our, very limited resources on objects. So would I pay a lot of money to conserve an object that, will probably never show and has no relevance to our population based on our demographics and what, our deep market research? I'd probably rather have some funds to buy something that is more relevant, and really, use it as the magic word that people keep saying to engage people. I mean, we really think that there's value when humans and objects come together. There's a chemistry there, and that has value that, of course, we can't quantify, but is telling and important.
I'd like to follow Betsy on that, and actually, I'm really quite excited by what my colleagues have already said, and I would actually love to comment on some of those things as well, because I think that this is one thing leads to another, and there were several things that I found extremely interesting. For example, what Michael was saying about selling the 1% of collections of all museums. I'd like to clarify that not all museums are the Art Institute of Chicago, and that many museums do not have the quality of art in that storage that could be really significantly valuable to be able to make up for all those things. And I think that it does have to do with leadership. It has to do with leadership, ambition, and responsibility, like Betsy's saying. How is that we want to manage our balance sheet? We don't need to sell objects to be a free museum. Dallas Museum has been free almost all its life, its existence. We only charge admission for a few years at the peak of the crisis in 2008, but the rest of the 117 years that we plus that we have, it's always been free, and I think that the use of collections, like Betsy was saying, is what is really important. it's how we relate to our constituents, how we serve our constituents, and how we use all those objects. Because what we have to do is to be able to make those objects have a meaning, you know, and when I say be able to, is the objects on their own habit, but we have to construct narratives around them. We have to construct the stories that people will resonate with, you know, where people will identify, mirror, or question things, mirror themselves or question things. And I also, I really loved everything that Erin was saying. I have a little point on that. When she said that museums that focus in collection do not focus in audiences, I also don't agree. You know, I think that we live in a world where there are so many shades and and that there's, I like to kind of bring back the point that museums actually exist to serve and benefit the people. You know, we work for our communities. A museum with no people is basically a vault in a bank. There's no need to have that, you know, that the museum exists as long as there is interaction with the visitor, with the community. And that's when we become relevant. It's in that moment that we find a meaning, a purpose. And I don't think that museums that focus in collection, we focus in our collection, but we focus on our collection in ways that the collection is used to serve the people. You know, this is the way that we interact, the way that we have community dialogues, to be able to construct exhibitions, to make sure that what we're going to be presenting in our permanent galleries, not only on temporary exhibits, it's really sound and respectful and in line with our community. So one thing doesn't exclude the other. So Erin said it's not one either or. I think it's and the last thing I like to say is, yes, I mean, there's a lot of storage works in the storage. Most of them in many places, especially in museums that are not as big as MoMA, Met, or Art Institute, you know, those objects will not really bring you a lot of money, or not even meaningful money. You know, the cost that it takes to sell those objects is huge. And why would you go to that if you're not going to get any revenue that you could use for something else? But I think that the best use is how we best use those collections. You know, as we're planning our we're designing our new strategic plan, we're considering how is that we can transfer, lend, support libraries, hospitals, other smaller museums with objects that can be really significant for other communities, and that it's likely that we will never show them, you know, because the way that museums, we started with 3 works of art, we have close to 26,000 now. Can we actually show those? A huge part of it are work on paper. A huge part of that is textiles. We won't ever be able to show them all at once, you know. And just thinking about that the solution is just selling something to really enlarge your footprint. We all would like to have more footprint, and many of us will pursue that for years and years. But I think that was a big mistake that museum made in the last 15 to 20 years. You know, just trying to get bigger and bigger without considering that being bigger is not just the operational cost of hiring more personnel, but actually the care of that collection while you expand also becomes a huge liability, like Erin so well said. So I kind of wanted to add on those things.
Wonderful. I'm watching the questions come in, and there's one that's actually very pertinent to this topic that Agustín, that you've been touching upon. The question is about stewardship and about what that really means and how the museum is responsible for these objects. So a question about stewardship: decisions we make now about what to deaccession in terms of what we consider to be the lesser value in the collection, or that we are not showing, might turn out to be the interest or the important works 50 years from now. This is something that is, I mean, this is a curatorial conversation as well, but you can't separate curatorship from collections. Okay, good. I'm going to go to Michael first. I didn't even get to finish the question. So just as many overlooked women or BIPOC or LGBTQ artists have been undervalued in the past, one can't guarantee that the works that deaccession will be shown or cared for in the future. I think the guarantee is a core element to that question, but I'm going to let Michael start the response here.
Well, right. There is no escaping the obligation to make decisions that have consequences. And sometimes you don't know everything about how they will turn out. But that's why you get the big bucks. That's why we have professionals and experts running our museums, because it's simply not possible. I mean, are we going to say that all of the art in the world should eventually wind up in museums and be accumulated forever? No, it's unthinkable. We simply can't do that. So we have to make these decisions. And I'd also point out that selling a work of art from a museum is not at all the same thing as putting it out in the trash or destroying it. The art is still there, and it'll be in somebody's hands who cared enough for it to buy it, not just any random person, or in a smaller museum than yours that will really value it. So it doesn't leave the planet. It goes to a place where it's actually creating art engagement instead of living in your basement. So I think you could, just the idea that you're unwilling to make a decision because you could be wrong in the future simply doesn't make sense. And it's really an irresponsible management principle, because not making a decision is making a decision. You're deciding to keep that work instead of something else. And there's something else that you could have bought if only you had, right? That's the one that'll turn out to be really valuable in the future, and you passed it up. So this idea of opportunity cost seems to me really at the center of this conversation, and we should keep it there. What are you giving up by deciding to have all of that stuff in your basement that you will never, reasonably speaking, show? Well, you're giving up a lot in terms of what museums are supposed to really create, and that should be confronted and looked at directly.
Erin?
So I want to address two things. One is that just the kind of conversations we have in these settings are often about large visible organizations in metropolitan areas. And I want to be clear that that is a very small percentage of museums that exist. New York State alone is home to more than 2,500 museum organizations. And we talk about the Met and MoMA. We talk about two of those organizations, or the Whitney, and there are many different kinds. So when I'm talking about museums that focus on collecting, as opposed to focusing on audience, I am talking about small regional organizations that struggle to pay their electric bill, that cannot pay their staff a fair wage, but they are maintaining storage rooms that are full of poorly maintained artifacts. So, and I also want to stress, that's already been mentioned, often deaccession is an upside down activity for an organization. It costs more to remove objects from the collection than that organization will ever receive in any kind of return. It does not matter where you want to put that money, because there will be no money to place in any fund or use for any purpose. Also, deaccessioning and transferring to other organizations is often not the best choice. I do not like it when large regional organizations offer their deaccessions to smaller organizations when the big place knows that this is not a museum quality object. They're just offering it because they want the public to understand that they're offering this. But if you're a small organization and the big guy offers you a thing, you're like, oh, the big guy's offering us this thing, we should take it. They should not take it. No one should have offered it to begin with. So The other thing I want to point out is that if you are a collector, a private collector, things come and go from your collection all the time. That is like breathing, right? You take in oxygen, you exhale carbon dioxide, you continually improve your collection. I have talked to so many collectors that have sold something out of their collection and bought it back 25 years later because they realized they really wanted it. You know, they regretted the choice. We can also do that. You know, there's nothing, as Michael just said, the thing is not destroyed in most cases, right? So there may be an opportunity to reacquire that work, and that would be fine. You know, that's fine. We are afraid. Museums, most of the museums that I talk to and work with are afraid of the consequences of their choices, but they're not afraid of the consequences that matter in the long term, which is the acquisition, the consequence of the acquisition. They're more afraid of the consequence of the deaccession, which is a real unfortunate place to be in. And I really hope that we can, as part of this, the thing that's most exciting to me about this conversation is that I really hope the public begins to understand a little bit more about the real situation that goes on in most American museums, which are not the Met or MoMA.
I just like to tack on to that, Erin, that I have former students who have been very lucky in finding positions at some of those major museums that you have identified, and still have to take a second job. So it is a larger issue. Another question that just came in: how do we convince our directors, curators, and board members to slow collecting, especially when large donations are offered? And the carrot there. How could you talk about collections and acquisition policies, or could we talk about collections and acquisition policies and how they relate to mission? How do collection focus ethos in a mission block fulfillment of the organizational mission with its associated need to fulfill public engagement? Agustín?
Well, I think that a lot of this has to do with vision and commitment. Being clear about what is that you want to do and how is that you want to relate to your community, to your constituents, and what kind of organization you want to have. I recently had this beautiful object presented by one of my curators, extraordinary piece, and shared with some of trustees, and I came back to the curator and I said, if you had this money that this object costs right now, would it be the object you would go for, or would you look for something else with that same money? It is what is really the best object that you can bring to the collection for the purpose of serving the community that you would acquire with that money. This I think that we all, and I would ask that there's some trust in leadership too, because I think with directors, when we come to this point, we had been trained, we have been experienced. Not some of us have been longer in the field than others, but I think that we all in general, and this is the really difficult conversation that we have. We try to generalize about something that is as unique and as each of the organizations that we talk about. It's but we all have, I would say, a clear understanding that if I'm gonna pass and transfer other objects to another institution, I'm not gonna give them trash. I'm not gonna give an object to anyone unless I know that it's worth and relevant for that specific community. I'm not just trying to clean. It's not a garage sale. It's not cleaning the storage. You really have to do serious work on all these things, and you have to be as strict in collecting and thinking what is collecting now meaningful for you today. For us at the DMA, we changed completely the way, and this started long ago. You know, we diversified our curatorial team in contemporary art. So we had a specialist in African diaspora and African Americans, and a specialist in Asian art, and a specialist in Latin American art. Because what we are looking to do is to create our own canon that will reflect our communities, that will really engage with our communities. So there's a purpose on what we are doing. You know, we're largely collecting women artists. We've been acquiring for the last almost 5 years in my tenure, for every 2 pieces that had come of a male artist, there's been 1 piece acquired from a woman. And you know, this was basically the result of a commitment, not of a plan of saying we have to have 30% of money allocated for women. It's just having the right curators, you know. And we have largely grown also with people of color, artists, BIPOCs, you know. And this is because we live in a city that is so diverse, and that we really need to be able to engage with them in a meaningful way. You know, if we don't serve our community, why are we here?
Betsy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to echo a lot of what Agustín has said. I mean, I'm in a small museum compared to the ones you all are talking about. And in a city that is 87% African American, and a state that is 40% African American. And, you know, like Kaywin said, those demographics aren't going back to the way they used to be. And so thinking about the community and thinking about the voices at the table when we make decisions about what we're going to collect, I think is also really important. You know, the voice that's often missing is the layperson, right? The person who loves to come to see exhibits at the museum, the person who doesn't always look like we look. And our chief curator now is African American, not just a curator, but our chief curator, because that voice is so important. And I think we need to remember that there was a great article in Hyperallergic this week by Daniel Larkin, reminding us that the museum model was started at a very particular place in a very particular time, you know, in 18th century Europe. And our processes have been built as though there should be a permanent model, and that, you know, we're not in 18th century Europe. I'm certainly not. And our practices need to reflect where we are in time and place. So what I'm hoping for is kind of just an openness. I think this conversation about deaccessioning gets so emotional and sometimes irrational, and that if we can just, you know, if we were to invent a system now in our worlds about how we acquire and collect and deaccession art, what would it look like? I'm really interested in that conversation.
Thank you. Anybody else? Erin?
I just, I want to address a few things that have come up in the chat, in the Q&A. So this is sort of a broad statement. There are a number of questions about specific types of objects, like works on paper and textiles, which cannot be exhibited all the time, right? And actually no work should be exhibited all the time. Unfortunately, you know, maybe not unfortunately, ironically, you know, showing a work is at odds with our preservation mission, right? Every time we put something out, we are exposing that object to risk, right? So, but I want to say that each time a museum, each time we think individually about our individual work responsibilities, our individual curatorial department, our individual object needs, we are identifying this uniqueness where we say, oh, well, that doesn't apply to me because X, Y, and Z. But it really is very valuable to think about how outside of the rules we have placed on ourselves for our work, how just what Betsy just said, like if we had not made up all of these rules for ourselves, what would this look like? And what would museums look like without the entrenchment of worrying about what other museums will think, of worrying about whether or not there's enough scholarship in this exhibition? Is there enough new scholarship in this exhibition? You know, we used to do things very differently. And I think we've forgotten that, you know, we have created these rules. We are a victim of ourselves to a certain extent. So, you know, when we get stuck up against the wall with things we're allowed to do, we're not allowed to do ethically or legally, or just, you know, in fear of judgment of our colleagues, we made that and we can unmake it. And I think we don't give ourselves enough credit to try something different and do things differently.
I think
and I really wish that we would be more courageous in doing that.
Erin, that's a fantastic point. And I think that gets to the heart of something that Agustín had been bringing up in terms of, I use the term authority and I don't like using that term, but you know, it is, you know, the directors and the curator, this is what they're hired to, this is their career, not just their job, this is their focus and their passion. And I think sometimes that does get lost in that, you know, this, as you're saying, this is us doing it. But you know, I don't know. I think the trust issue between public and the internal museum profession. I think that there's something missing there, or there's something that we're not kind of, you know, seeing.
I just want to add one point.
Go ahead, Joe. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to add one point about the cost of collecting. I think that sometimes as a field we bring it on ourselves and make it more difficult. Let's just take the kind of triple insurance that we often require of one another when we lend and borrow works. We require of each other to build a box within a box within a box, at huge expense. We then, on top of that, require courier service, which is yet another layer. We then require of each other absurd insurance rates, sending money to insurance companies. We've in effect triple or quadruple insured these works at huge cost and with really no balancing of the actual risk beneath it. And I find it infuriating and a crazy waste of money. Why do we do that?
I think we're actually, something that good came out of the pandemic is that we are really revisiting a lot of those issues. You know, I mean, the fact that we're not, we just opened Juan Gris exhibit today and brought close to 40 objects, 38 objects from Europe, different places, very important museums, most important museums, and across the United States. There was no one physical courier, you know, right. and that was kind of the great thing. And we started, I've been long advocating for that too, you know, that there's so much expenditure that has to do, when we talk about acquiring works, you know, it's even the travel of the curators to get somewhere to see an object. That's part of the cost of acquiring works, you know. So I think that we're starting to see in the field that we can be more generous to our own kind and that we can be more cooperative. Yes, you know, and I 100% agree with what you're saying. And thank you for bringing this up, because if anybody else is hearing us, we all have to be very mindful that we can do a better world, a better field if we work collectively, you know, and if we, like just Betsy said, and Erin, you know, we have imposed ourselves with rules, you know. How can we rewrite those rules, you know? As we want to reinvent our museums, I think that every director that is leading an institution today is being challenged by 100 things, you know, and it's not only the finances, the economics that are struggling us, you know. There's a lot more things, you know, about trust and relevance and service, you know. At this moment, I think that the great thing about this pandemic is that we have an opportunity to reinvent ourselves, you know, and we have been forced to do it. And I think that we're starting to have the conversations like today that will probably bring meaningful change.
There's so many fantastic. Oh, Betsy, sorry, go ahead. Oh, there are so many fantastic questions that are coming in through the through the chat that we're not going to be able to address. One last one that I'd like to ask the group: the consequence. What are the consequences for a collecting institution that needs to stop collecting? You know, after a review, after considering some of the elements that we've discussed today in terms of that real, you know, finite cost. You know, what might happen, whether it's because of a lack of storage or staffing or funds, which are, again, all intertwined in this. What might happen to a museum that stops taking in objects?
Maybe the museum gets to reinvent itself. Maybe that's great for that museum. Maybe that museum becomes a mass MoCA and just stops owning objects and they borrow objects. Maybe the museum closes.
And sharing objects, I think, is a really generative way to think about it. You know, there's in the news about the Sam Gilliam piece that Houston and Boston are sharing, but I don't see a downside to stopping if it's not in the best interest of your museum and your community.
I think this is a hard cases make bad law question, actually. You don't have to stop collecting, but and when we talk about deaccessioning, people usually say, "Oh my goodness, you're going to sell your masterpieces off the gallery that I always love to visit," and everybody. No, that's very unusual. We're talking about selling things you can't show and never will. And in terms of stopping collecting, how about just collecting with a livable, sustainable policy? And a quick example I'd give is if you're a person of wealth and you want to give Harvard University a building, Harvard is going to be very grateful to you and treat you nicely and say thank you. But they're also going to say, and by the way, before we put a shovel in the ground for your building, we want a like sum to endow maintenance and operation of that building. And then we'll be just delighted to accept it. Now, my own institution isn't rich enough to make that kind of demand of donors, and sometimes we get in trouble for it. But I think museums would be very well advised to say, oh, we love it. You know, it's beautiful. It will go right here. But before we are going to access it to our collection, we'd like you to endow the long stream of maintenance and conservation and protection costs, and then we'll be glad to accept it. And that's a totally reasonable expectation to put before a donor.
Yeah, and I think we're following that practice, many of us, you know, when we get large collections, we usually ask, you know, not only expect, but ask actively, you know, is there money coming with so we can take care of the collection, you know, so that will go into endowment for those purposes. And I think that we don't have to stop collecting. You know, we just have to be very, very mindful about what are we collecting and why. You know, and really make sure that we don't feel like bringing objects to the collection is not an accumulative process. What we want to do, it's a very selective, mindful, planned construction of a collection. And I think that there's also one thing that we talk about that we in the field have not really explored. I see within my own neighbors, you know, there are some of us are very strong in certain holdings. And some of them actually have large of those holdings in the storage. Can we balance by having long-term loans exchanges so we really can tell a full story that we need to share with our constituents, you know, and be more cooperative, you know? To me, what it's about today is really strategic alliances, you know, it's how I'm going to talk to my peers to have something that will benefit both of us.
I could build on that for a second.
Very quickly, Betsy.
Okay, yeah, we, to your point, we had a program run by a graduate of your program, Andrew, Dr. Riddell Hearn, where we shared objects with a local HBCU. And it has a very significant collection, and we shared a position, we shared exhibition space, we shared collections, we shared students. I think this whole idea of sharing really is a path forward for those of us who are under-resourced in so many ways.
Can I make like one tiny comment?
30 seconds.
Okay, 30 seconds. Museums and collections are not permanent. They do not need to be permanent. If museums close, that is part of life. That is, museums are born every day, and it's okay if some museums don't make it. It's crazy. I know.
That's quite a way to end. I want to thank the entire. I want to thank the audience for some absolutely fantastic questions. I am very sorry that we weren't able to address everything people were sending us, but please stay tuned for the next sessions that are going to address many similar topics to what we've been talking about. I want to thank all of my panelists. Thank you so much for taking the time this morning. This was a fantastic and very interesting conversation. I'd also like to thank one of our graduate students, Paul Cohen, who's been assisting me on the back end with the moderation for his work. We have a full day of sessions today, and we will be taking brief breaks in between. So now you have a few minutes before our next session begins. Each session does have a dedicated link to join that is in your PDF agenda. You can always check our bulletin board using the homepage, vpa.syr.edu/deaccessioning-after-2020 for all up-to-date changes and announcements. Thank you to our panel, and I'm looking forward to this continued conversation.